The photographer has been adjusting the same lamp for 11 minutes. It is a large tin reflector on a wooden stand, and it throws a hard white light across the row of 5 young women seated at the switchboard. And the light keeps catching a shine on the varnished wood in a way the photographer does not like. He steps back. He steps forward. He asks the girl on the far left to lift her chin 2 inches. He asks her to hold it there. This is a promotional photograph for the telephone company, taken on a Tuesday afternoon in the autumn of 1934, and it will run in a company magazine under a caption that reads something like, "The Voice of Tomorrow." 5 operators sit in a straight line at the switchboard, each one wearing the same dark uniform with the same white collar, each one wearing a headset with a single earpiece and a mouthpiece on a thin metal arm, each one holding a cord in one hand as though caught in the middle of connecting a call. Their hair is pinned in the same style. Their backs are straight. Their hands are positioned at the exact same height above the board, fingers slightly curled, as if a single wire ran through all 5 bodies and held them in place. The young woman, third from the left, is named Eleanor Voss. She is 22 years old. She has been told to smile, and she is smiling, and the smile has been held for so long now that the muscles along her jaw have begun to ache in a way that will not fully release until well after she is home tonight. Her eyes are directed slightly upward and to the left, toward a point above the photographer's head that someone decided, in an earlier photograph for an earlier campaign, looked bright and alert and capable. She has practiced this exact angle of gaze in the mirror at the boarding house 3 times this week, because the photograph matters to the company, and the company has made clear that it matters. And because a girl who cannot hold a pleasant, alert expression for the length of a photograph is a girl who may not be suited to holding a pleasant, alert voice for the length of an 8-hour shift. The uniform collar is stiff and starched and sits close against her throat. It is warm under the lamp. There is a bead of perspiration forming at her hairline that she is doing everything in her power not to let anyone see, because a shining forehead in a company photograph, she has been told, suggests a certain lack of composure, and composure is the entire point of this image. The photographer finally gets the shot he wants. He tells them to hold it. The shutter clicks, and for 1/60th of a second, the telephone company has exactly what it was trying to produce. 5 identical young women, calm, capable, cheerful, projecting the quiet competence of a service that never falters and never tires and never, under any circumstance, shows the strain of what it actually requires. The photograph will be reproduced in the company magazine, distributed to shareholders and civic groups, and the occasional local newspaper eager to run a feel-good story about the modern marvels of telephone service. Readers will see 5 composed young women and draw from the image exactly the conclusion the company intends them to draw, that the service connecting their calls is staffed by capable, contented workers performing a pleasant, orderly task in a clean, well-lit environment. Nothing in the frame will contradict this impression, because everything in the frame was arranged, adjusted, and held in place specifically to prevent any contradiction from appearing. What the photograph does not show, what no photograph from this era ever shows, is the other 23 hours and 59 minutes of the day. It does not show the groove that the steel headband leaves across the top of Eleanor's ears after 8 hours of continuous wear. It does not show the ache that runs from her shoulder blades to the base of her skull from sitting perfectly upright for an entire shift, reaching for jacks positioned above her natural line of sight. It does not show the supervisor pacing the aisle behind the board with a stopwatch, timing the exact number of seconds between a flashing light and a plugged cord. It does not show the 3 a.m. hours when the exchange room goes quiet and dark, and Eleanor is the only waking presence tethered by copper wire to an entire sleeping city. The photograph shows the voice with a smile. It does not show what the smile costs, or how it is manufactured, or what happens to the woman wearing it once the shutter has closed and the lamp has been switched off, and she has returned to the board for the 7 remaining hours of her shift. There is a particular kind of nostalgia that has attached itself in recent years to the image of the telephone operator. You have likely encountered it without naming it. The vintage aesthetic accounts on the internet that post photographs of switchboards and call them charming. The old films where the operator's voice arrives crisp and warm through the receiver saying, "Number please," in a tone that suggests she has been waiting all day for the pleasure of connecting this particular call. The retro fashion boards that pin the uniform, the little pillbox hat, the tidy gloves, and treat the entire job as a kind of elegant costume from a gentler, more mannered era of American life. What you are actually looking at in every one of those images is a masterpiece of concealment. And tonight, we are going to see what was concealed. Because the reality of working a telephone exchange in the 1930s, particularly the reality of working it through the night, was not gentle, and it was not mannered. It was one of the most tightly monitored, physically demanding, and psychologically isolating jobs available to a young woman in America. And the company that employed her went to real lengths to keep that reality away from the public. The cheerful voice on the other end of the line was a manufactured product, drilled and timed and supervised with a rigor that would be recognizable to anyone who has worked under a modern productivity tracker. And the woman producing that voice was, for 8 hours at a stretch, required to function less like a person and more like a precisely calibrated piece of the equipment she operated. This video is going to walk through what that actually looked like. The rules that governed her body, down to the position of her legs under the desk. The training that shaped her voice into something the company considered acceptable. The mental catalogue of names and numbers she carried in her head because there was no digital directory, only her memory. The supervisor listening silently on the line, testing whether her cheerfulness held under the strain of a difficult caller. The specific, eerie texture of the deep night shift, when the frantic pace of the daytime exchange falls away into long stretches of silence, broken only by a single, sudden light on a dark board. And what it felt like, finally, to unclamp the headset at dawn and walk out into the cool morning air, disconnected at last from a night full of other people's voices. The particular irony of the modern nostalgia for this profession is that the qualities most celebrated in the retro aesthetic, the poise, the pleasantness, the seemingly effortless command of the board, were precisely the qualities that required the most extraction from the women performing them. Nothing about that poise arrived naturally or easily. It was built, piece by piece, through weeks of training and years of ongoing correction, and it was maintained, shift after shift, through a level of physical and psychological discipline that the charming vintage photograph was specifically designed never to reveal. The modern viewer scrolling past an image of a smiling operator in a neat uniform is responding to the product of that discipline without any awareness that a product is what they are looking at, manufactured through means considerably less charming than the finished image suggests. Before we go further, if this kind of honest history is something you value, if you prefer the real version to the polished one, take a moment to subscribe. It helps us keep making these. And if you would like to, leave a comment telling me which era or which profession you would like to see uncovered next. I read every one of them. Let us begin where every shift began, with the body itself clamped into its equipment at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, with a young woman named Eleanor. Eleanor Voss took the job at the exchange 2 years ago, in the autumn of 1932, when her father lost his position at the textile mill on the north side of the city. She was 20 years old at the time, She had finished school 2 years earlier and had been helping her mother with piecework at home, sewing collars for a shirt manufacturer at a rate that barely covered her own keep. When the mill let her father go, along with 60 other men in the same week, the household needed a second steady wage, and the telephone company was hiring. And the telephone company was hiring specifically young, unmarried women, because the company had determined, through years of internal study, that young, unmarried women produced the most consistent voice quality and the most compliant adherence to procedure. The hiring process itself was a kind of audition. Eleanor was asked to read a series of standard phrases aloud while a supervisor listened without looking at her, judging her voice alone, its pitch, its clarity, its warmth. She was asked to demonstrate her hearing with a series of faint tones played through a headset. She was asked to sit at a practice board and reach for a series of marked positions so the company could assess whether her arm length and finger dexterity were adequate to the physical demands of the equipment. She passed on all counts. She was told this made her a good candidate for what the company called, in its internal literature, a girl of the right type. The training lasted 3 weeks. Eleanor learned the mechanics of the board first, the exact sequence of motions required to answer an incoming call, ask for the number, locate the correct jack among hundreds of identical brass sockets, and complete the connection. She learned the standard phrases she was permitted to use, phrases that had been tested and approved by the company for their tone and their brevity, and she learned that she was not permitted to deviate from them. She learned the posture the company required, spine straight against the back of the chair, both feet flat on the floor, hands returning to a neutral resting position between calls rather than resting in her lap or against the desk edge, because a supervisor walking the aisle needed to be able to tell, at a glance, whether every operator on the board was in a state of readiness. By the end of the 3rd week, Eleanor had the mechanics down. What she had not yet fully understood, what would take months to understand, was the physical cost of sustaining those mechanics for 8 hours at a stretch, 6 nights a week, for years. The trainer who oversaw Eleanor's initial 3 weeks was a woman in her 40s named Miss Cartwright, who had worked the boards herself for over a decade before being promoted into a training role, and who carried, Eleanor noticed even then, a particular stiffness in her neck and shoulders that seemed to announce itself whenever she demonstrated a motion at the practice board. A small wince quickly suppressed the visible cost of a decade at the switchboard, worn into her own body in a way that Eleanor, 20 years old and newly hired, did not yet have the experience to fully interpret. Miss Cartwright was, by every account Eleanor gathered from the other new trainees, an excellent instructor, patient and thorough, and she never once, in 3 full weeks of training, mentioned the physical toll of the job directly, framing every lesson purely in terms of technique and procedure. Eleanor understands now, 2 years into her own experience of the work, exactly why that omission occurred. There was no vocabulary within the company's own training culture for discussing what the job cost a body over time, because acknowledging the cost would have required acknowledging that the cost existed, and acknowledging that the cost existed was simply not part of the product the company was in the business of producing. Her body, 2 years into the job, carries the marks of it plainly. There is a faint red groove across the top of each ear where the steel headband rests, a groove that fades somewhat on her days off but never fully disappears, because the days off are not frequent enough, and the groove has, by now, become a permanent feature of her ear's shape. Her shoulders sit slightly forward and rounded, the posture of someone who has spent 2 years reaching toward a board positioned just far enough away and just high enough up. That perfect posture was never actually comfortable, only correct. Her right hand, the hand that manipulates the chords, has developed a callus along the side of the index finger from the friction of the same repeated motion, thousands of times a night, night after night. She is small, 5 feet 3 inches, with dark hair that she pins each evening into the tight, low style the company prefers, because it keeps hair away from the headset and away from her face, and reads, in the supervisor's quick visual check, as neat. Her voice, which the company selected specifically for its natural warmth, has been further shaped by 2 years of training into something that does not entirely belong to her anymore. She has a version of her voice for the switchboard, pitched slightly higher than her natural register, carrying a specific cheerful lilt on certain approved phrases, and she has noticed, with a kind of quiet unease she has never mentioned to anyone, that this switchboard voice has begun to bleed into her regular speech, even when she is off the clock, even when she is home at the boarding house, talking to her landlady about nothing in particular. There is one small thing about Eleanor that nobody at the exchange knows. In the pocket of her uniform, on the left side, under the company badge, she keeps a small paper fan, painted with a faded design of blue cornflowers. She bought it 2 summers ago at the county fair, the last afternoon of genuine, unscheduled leisure she can clearly remember having, before her father lost his position and the nights at the switchboard began. She has never once used the fan at the board. It would be against the rules to produce any personal object during a shift, and the exchange room is rarely warm enough to need it anyway. But on certain nights, in certain hours, when the work has become almost unbearably monotonous, or when a particular call has left her rattled in a way she cannot name, she reaches into her pocket and touches the fan with 2 fingers, just to confirm it is there, just to remind herself, briefly and silently, that a version of her existed once, who spent an afternoon doing something for no reason except that it was pleasant. Tonight is a Tuesday in November, 1934. Her shift begins at 11 o'clock and will not end until 7 the following morning. The exchange room, when she arrives, is lit by a row of hanging bulbs that cast a flat, yellowish light across the long switchboard, and the air already carries the faint, particular smell that Eleanor has come to associate entirely with her working life, a mixture of hot electrical wiring, machine oil, and the ozone tang that rises off equipment that never fully powers down. Her father, in the 2 years since the mill closed his line down, has found only occasional work, a few weeks here helping a neighbour with carpentry, a stretch loading crates at the rail yard before that job too dried up. He does not speak of the mill often, but Eleanor has noticed the particular quiet that settles over him on the rare occasions someone mentions it in passing, a quiet that she recognizes now, having spent 2 years learning her own version of professional silence, as the specific quiet of a person absorbing something he is not permitted by his own sense of dignity to complain about out loud. Her wage from the exchange, modest as it is, has become the steadiest income in the household, a fact that neither she nor her parents discuss directly, but that sits, unspoken, under every meal the family shares and every small expense the household manages to afford. She hangs her coat. She takes her seat at the board. She lifts the heavy steel headset and settles it over her ears, feeling the familiar pressure begin to close in. The shift has begun. It will not end for 8 hours. If you imagine the equipment of a 1930s telephone operator, you probably picture something light, a simple earpiece maybe, a small microphone, the kind of thing that looks, in old photographs, almost like a piece of jewelry balanced on the head. The reality was a piece of industrial equipment built for function and durability, not comfort, and it was worn continuously, without relief, for the full length of an 8-hour shift. The headset Eleanor wears is a steel band that arcs over the top of the head, connecting a single earpiece on one side to a mouthpiece mounted on a thin metal arm that curves around toward the front of the face. The band itself is not padded in any meaningful way. There is a thin strip of leather or felt where it contacts the scalp, but the pressure required to hold the earpiece firmly against the ear so that Eleanor can hear a caller's voice clearly over the ambient hum of the exchange room is considerable, and that pressure is constant. It does not ease. It does not adjust itself as the hours pass. It sits at the same clamped tension at 7 in the morning as it did at 11 the night before. And by 7 in the morning, the top of Eleanor's ears have gone numb in a way she has simply learned to work around. The groove this leaves is not a minor cosmetic detail. Operators who have worked the boards for several years develop a permanent indentation across the top of the ear, a physical alteration to the cartilage itself, produced by thousands of hours of sustained pressure from a piece of equipment that was designed with almost no consideration for the body wearing it. Eleanor is 2 years into the job. The groove on her ears is still something that fades slowly on her days off. Women who have worked the exchange for 10 or 15 years carry a groove that never fades at all, a permanent record worn into the body of every shift they have ever completed. The posture required to work the board compounds the problem. The switchboard itself is a wall of jacks arranged in vertical columns, and the highest row sits above the natural resting height of a seated woman's arm. To reach it, an operator cannot simply extend her arm forward. She must sit fully upright, spine straight, and lift her arm at an angle that engages the shoulder and the upper back. And she must do this rapidly, precisely, hundreds of times an hour, reaching for whichever jack corresponds to whichever call has just come through. The posture that results over an 8-hour shift is one of continuous low-grade strain across the shoulders, the upper back, and the neck, made worse by the fact that the headset itself adds weight and tension to a neck already held rigid by the demands of the work. Eleanor's shoulders, at 22, already sit slightly forward and rounded, the beginning of a posture that will likely become permanent if she remains at the board for another 5 or 10 years, the way it has become permanent for several of the older women on the day shift, women in their 30s whose backs have taken on a curve that a doctor, if any of them could afford to see one, would likely attribute directly to the chair, the board, and the headset. The chair itself offers no relief. It is a plain wooden chair, unupholstered, selected by the company specifically because it holds an operator in an upright position and does not encourage the kind of slouching or leaning back that would slow her response time to an incoming call. There is no cushion. There is no adjustment for height. An operator sits in the chair the company has given her, in the posture the company requires, for 8 hours. And if her back aches by the 4th hour, which it does, there is no accommodation available. The work continues. The lights keep flashing. The stopwatch keeps running. By the end of a typical shift, Eleanor's shoulders carry a deep, structural ache that settles into her upper back and does not fully release until well into her sleep the following day, if it releases at all before the next shift begins. Her neck is stiff. The muscles along her jaw, which have held a specific, practiced, pleasant expression through call after call, regardless of what she is actually feeling, ache in a way that is separate from the physical strain of the posture, a muscular fatigue produced by hours of maintained facial performance rather than hours of rest. This is the equipment of the voice of tomorrow, a steel band that grooves the ear, a board positioned to strain the shoulder, a chair built for readiness rather than comfort, and the young woman's body absorbing all of it, night after night. Because the company has determined that this configuration produces the fastest response times and the clearest audio quality. And the company's determination, backed by its own internal efficiency studies, is the only variable that matters in how the equipment is designed. There were alternative headset designs available to the telephone companies of this period, versions with additional padding, versions that distributed pressure more evenly across the skull, rather than concentrating it along a narrow steel band. Some of the larger metropolitan exchanges experimented with these improved designs in limited trials during the early 1930s, but the improved designs were more expensive to manufacture and, in most cases, only marginally faster to don and remove between shift changes. And the calculation that determined which equipment an exchange actually purchased was, in every surviving record of the decision, a calculation of cost against measurable efficiency. Never a calculation of comfort against harm. Eleanor's exchange, a mid-sized operation serving a mid-sized city, uses the older, cheaper design, the one that grooves the ear, because the company that owns it has no internal metric that captures the difference between an operator whose ears ache and one whose ears do not. Only a metric that captures whether calls are being connected within the required number of seconds, and by that single metric, the cheaper headset performs identically to the more expensive one. This is, in its own quiet way, the clearest possible illustration of how the entire system was built. Not out of active cruelty, exactly. Nobody at the telephone company wakes up in the morning intending to groove the ears of a 22-year-old woman in a mid-sized city. But the system was built entirely around metrics that never once included her comfort as a variable worth measuring. And a system that does not measure a cost will, with total reliability, continue producing that cost indefinitely, because there is no internal signal ever generated that would prompt anyone to address it. Eleanor has heard, second-hand, that operators at a handful of the largest city exchanges petitioned informally for the improved headset design after enough of them developed visible irritation and, in a few reported cases, small infections along the edge of the ear where the steel band had broken the skin. The petitions, as far as she has heard the story told, went nowhere, absorbed into the same silence that absorbed every other informal complaint an operator might raise about the physical toll of her equipment. There was no formal grievance procedure through which such a request could travel, no department whose function was to weigh operator comfort against the cost of new equipment, and so the request simply dissolved, the way most requests of its kind dissolved, into nothing. Which brings us to a question that the glamorous image of the switchboard operator never raises. What exactly was she permitted to do with her own body while she sat at that board for 8 hours? The answer, drawn from actual company training manuals and supervisor guidelines of the era, is considerably narrower than most people would guess. Operators were instructed not to cross their legs while seated at the board. The stated reasoning, recorded in several company handbooks, was that crossed legs produced a posture inconsistent with the alert, ready bearing the company wished to project, and that an operator whose legs were crossed could be slower to rise or reposition if called upon. Whether this reasoning held any practical merit is almost beside the point. The rule existed, it was enforced, and Eleanor has spent 2 years learning to sit for 8 hours at a stretch with both feet flat on the floor, because a supervisor walking the aisle behind the board would note a crossed leg and record it as an infraction. Operators were instructed not to speak to one another during a shift, except in the brief, tightly bounded circumstances the company permitted, generally a few minutes during a scheduled break. The reasoning here was more directly practical. Conversation between operators slowed response time and created the possibility of a missed light on the board, a caller left waiting while 2 women exchanged a sentence about something unrelated to the work. But the effect of the rule went beyond efficiency. It meant that Eleanor could sit for 8 hours within arm's reach of 4 or 5 other young women who shared the same working conditions, the same physical strain, the same isolation, and exchange almost nothing with them beyond a glance, because actual conversation was against the rules, and the supervisor's presence made the rule enforceable in practice, not just on paper. Operators were required to use a specific, limited set of phrases when handling a call, phrases that had been tested by the company for tone and efficiency, and approved for use across the entire exchange. Number, please. 1 moment. I am connecting you now. I am sorry, that line is busy. Eleanor was trained to use these phrases and almost nothing else, and she was trained to deliver them in a specific tone, warm but brisk, present but impersonal. A voice calibrated to sound like genuine, attentive service without ever straying into anything that might be interpreted as personal engagement with the caller. A caller who tried to draw her into conversation, who asked how her day was going or made a comment about the weather, would be met with a polite but immediate redirection back to the business of the call. Because lingering in conversation, however pleasant, costs seconds, and seconds, multiplied across an entire shift, cost the company measurable efficiency. Even the matter of using the washroom was subject to a level of oversight that would strike a modern worker as extraordinary. Operators could not simply rise from the board when the need arose. They were required to signal a supervisor, who would arrange for a relief operator to take their position at the board before they were permitted to leave. And the length of their absence was noted, and a pattern of frequent or lengthy absences was treated as a performance concern to be addressed directly with the operator in question. Eleanor has learned, as every operator learns, to manage her own body's needs around the rhythm of the shift, timing her requests for relief to moments when the board is less busy, restricting her intake of water and coffee before a shift specifically to reduce the number of times she will need to ask. The company justified this level of oversight in its own internal literature as a matter of maintaining continuous coverage on the board, a legitimate operational concern given that any position left unstaffed, even briefly, meant incoming calls to that section going unanswered. But the practical effect on Eleanor and her fellow operators went well beyond the stated justification. She has learned, over 2 years, to experience even the most basic biological needs of her own body as something requiring advance authorization. A small but persistent erosion of autonomy that she has never had occasion to name directly, but that she has certainly felt, in the particular low-grade tension of holding her own needs at bay while waiting for a supervisor to notice her raised hand and arrange for relief. On a busy night, this wait can stretch to 10 or 15 minutes, and Eleanor has learned to simply absorb the discomfort rather than press the matter, because pressing the matter, in her 2 years of experience, has never once shortened the wait, and has occasionally been noted in the same small notebook where Mrs. Pruitt records connection delays as a sign of impatience. None of this appeared in the company magazine. None of it appeared in the promotional photograph, where 5 smiling women sat with straight backs and pleasant expressions, embodying, for the length of a single 60th of a second, exactly the image the company wanted the public to associate with the telephone service. The straight back in that photograph was not a natural posture. It was a trained one, reinforced by 2 years of correction, and the pleasant expression was not spontaneous warmth. It was a manufactured product, and the factory that manufactured it was Eleanor's own face, trained and monitored and adjusted until it produced, on command, exactly what the company required. There was also, running beneath all of these individual rules, a broader expectation that governed the entirety of an operator's conduct, both on the exchange floor and, to a degree that would surprise a modern worker, off it as well. Many telephone companies of this era maintained explicit conduct standards for their operators that extended well past the working day, addressing where an unmarried operator was permitted to live, whom she was permitted to be seen with in public, and what hours she was expected to keep even on her nights off. Eleanor's own boarding house was one on an approved list the company maintained, a list of establishments the company had inspected and deemed suitable for the young women in its employ, run by landladies who were themselves expected, informally but unmistakably, to report any conduct that might reflect poorly on the company's reputation. This was framed, in the company's own literature, as a form of protection extended to young women living away from their families for the first time. It functioned, in practice, as an extension of the same surveillance that governed her posture and her voice during the working shift, reaching now into the hours when she was not even at the board. A continuous expectation of respectability that Eleanor has simply absorbed as the ordinary condition of her employment, the way she has absorbed the ache in her shoulders and the groove across her ears, without ever having occasion to compare it against any other way a working life might be lived. For Eleanor, the voice itself presented its own particular challenge, one that had nothing to do with her natural speaking ability and everything to do with what the company had decided to do with it. If you imagine that a pleasant telephone voice was simply a natural gift some women happened to possess, a fortunate quality that made them suited to the job, you are picturing something considerably simpler than what actually occurred inside the training rooms of the telephone company. The voice with a smile, the phrase the company itself used in its internal training literature, was not a description of a naturally cheerful disposition. It was a specific, drilled vocal technique, taught deliberately, monitored continuously, and treated by the company as a core piece of technical competence, no different in kind from learning to operate the board itself. The technique rested on a simple physiological premise, one the company had apparently confirmed through its own internal testing. A person who smiles while speaking produces a measurably different sound than a person who does not. A slight lift in pitch, a particular openness in the tone, that a listener perceives as warmth even when they cannot see the speaker's face. The company trained its operators to smile continuously while speaking, regardless of whether there was anyone present to see the smile, specifically to produce this vocal effect, and supervisors were trained to listen for its absence. Eleanor learned this technique during her 3 weeks of training, practicing in front of a small mirror set up at each practice station, watching her own face as she repeated the approved phrases, adjusting the width and duration of her smile until a trainer, listening without watching her, confirmed that the tone had achieved the desired warmth. She was corrected during this process more times than she can now recall. Not enough smile, and the trainer would ask her to try again. Too wide a smile, oddly, produced its own problem, a strained, artificial brightness that read as false rather than warm, and she had to learn the precise, narrow range of expression that produced the effect the company wanted, without tipping into something that sounded, even to an untrained ear, like performance rather than genuine pleasantness. The company reinforced this training continuously once operators reached the floor. Small mirrors, similar to the ones used in the training rooms, were mounted at several positions along the switchboard itself, positioned so that an operator, glancing up during a call, could check her own expression and correct it if it had slipped. Eleanor still catches herself doing this, glancing at the mirror mounted near her station, checking that her face is arranged correctly, even during the deep, exhausted hours of the night shift, when there is no supervisor immediately visible, and the correction has become, after 2 years, almost entirely automatic. What this training demanded, in practice, was a sustained and total separation between what Eleanor actually felt and what her voice was required to project. A caller who was rude to her, who spoke sharply or made an unreasonable demand, received the exact same warm, smiling tone as a caller who was pleasant and patient. A caller who arrived at the end of a difficult call, one that had left Eleanor's hands slightly unsteady, received the same tone as the caller who arrived at the very start of her shift, before 8 hours of accumulated strain had begun to wear at her. The voice did not fluctuate with her actual state. It was trained specifically not to fluctuate, and the not fluctuating was itself the skill the company had hired her for and continued to monitor throughout her employment. There is something worth pausing on here. Eleanor's genuine warmth, the actual, natural kindness that had made her a strong candidate for this job in the first place, was not simply allowed to express itself. It was captured, standardized, and reproduced on command, regardless of whether the underlying feeling was present in that particular moment. The company had, in effect, industrialized a human emotional expression, breaking it down into its component physical mechanics, drilling those mechanics until they could be summoned instantly and sustained indefinitely, and installing the entire system inside a young woman's body as though it were another piece of equipment on the board. Eleanor's jaw aches by the middle of most shifts from the sustained muscular effort of maintaining this expression. It is not an ache she has ever mentioned to anyone, because it has never occurred to her that it might be worth mentioning. It is simply what the job requires, the same way the headset requires her ears to bear its weight, the same way the board requires her shoulders to bear the strain of the reach. The voice with a smile has a cost, measured in the small, private currency of a jaw that aches by midnight and does not fully release until she is asleep. The company's investment in this technique extended well beyond initial training. Supervisors conducted periodic voice reviews in which an operator was pulled briefly from the board and asked to demonstrate her approved phrases for a senior trainer who would grade her tone against a standard the company had refined over years of internal testing. Eleanor has undergone 4 of these reviews in her 2 years at the exchange, and she recalls each one with a specific, low-grade dread that has never fully faded. A sense of being evaluated not for what she does, but for how convincingly she can perform an emotion she may or may not be feeling in that particular moment. She has, without exception, passed every review, but the review itself, the fact of it recurring every few months without warning, reinforces the underlying message the company has built its entire training system around, that her natural voice was never sufficient on its own, that it required constant correction and confirmation, that the warmth callers heard on the other end of the line was, at every stage, a product subject to quality control, rather than a simple expression of who she actually was. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from this arrangement, one that Eleanor has never had adequate language to describe to herself, let alone to anyone else. It is the exhaustion of performing an emotion continuously, for hours, regardless of its relationship to whatever she is actually experiencing underneath, and of knowing that the performance itself is being periodically tested and graded, so that even the moments when no supervisor happens to be listening carry within them the constant possibility that they might be. She has come to think of it, on the rare nights when she allows herself to think about it directly at all, as wearing her own face the way she wears the headset, a piece of equipment clamped into place and worn continuously, its weight becoming, over enough repetition, almost impossible to distinguish from her actual, natural expression. There have been a small handful of moments, scattered across her 2 years at the exchange, when Eleanor has caught herself wondering, in the brief privacy of the walk home or the quiet of her boarding house room, what her own voice actually sounds like anymore. Apart from the trained instrument the company has spent 2 years shaping and correcting. She does not mean this as a dramatic or self-pitying question. It arrives, when it arrives, more as a simple, practical curiosity, the way a person might wonder, after wearing the same style of shoe for years, what walking barefoot on grass would even feel like anymore. She suspects, though she has no clear way of testing it, that her natural speaking voice and her switchboard voice have drawn closer together than they once were. 2 years of nightly practice narrowing whatever gap originally existed between the woman she was before the training and the operator the company has spent 2 years producing. Now, the mental side of the job. Because the physical strain of the headset and the trained precision of the voice were only 2 components of what the exchange demanded from Eleanor, the third component lived entirely inside her memory, and it was, in its own way, the most demanding of the 3. If you picture an operator's job as fundamentally mechanical, a matter of plugging cords into the correct sockets, you are missing the layer of the work that made the mechanics possible in the first place. Before Eleanor can plug a cord into anything, she must know where it goes. And in 1934, there was no directory sitting in front of her, no reference book she could consult mid-call, no digital system holding the information for her. There was only her memory, trained and drilled over months, holding a working catalogue of names, numbers, and locations that numbered, on the exchange she worked, somewhere in the range of several hundred active subscriber lines. This was not an exaggeration for effect. This was the literal operating requirement of the job. A caller would come through, often identifying themselves not by a number, but by a name. Connect me to the Hendersons, or by a business. Get me the feed store. And Eleanor was expected to know immediately, without hesitation, which jack on the board corresponded to that name or that business. There was a paper directory available for reference, but consulting it took time, and time was the one resource the job did not allow her to spend freely. A skilled operator did not consult the directory for a familiar name. A skilled operator simply knew. The way a skilled typist knows which key sits under which finger without looking down. Eleanor's mental catalogue, 2 years into the job, includes not only the names and numbers of the exchange's subscribers, but a working knowledge of their patterns. She knows that the Hendersons' line is often busy in the early evening because Mrs. Henderson's sister calls at that hour most days. She knows that the doctor's office line takes priority regardless of the time of night because a call to that line is never idle chatter. She knows which businesses close at what hour and are unlikely to answer after that point, and she has learned, through repetition rather than instruction, an entire informal social geography of the city's telephone-owning population, held entirely in her own head, refreshed and updated every single night as she works the board. This mental load compounds during the exact moments when the physical demands of the job are also at their most intense, because the two cannot be separated. A call comes in. A light flashes on the board. Eleanor must simultaneously locate the correct jack for the incoming line, recall or quickly confirm the number or name the caller is requesting, locate the second jack corresponding to that destination, and physically complete the connection, all while maintaining the trained vocal warmth the company requires, and all while doing so within the few seconds that company efficiency standards allow for a single connection. The mental and the physical operate as a single continuous action, and any hesitation in one immediately shows up as a delay in the other. The company was aware of the mental demands of the position and had studied them directly. Internal efficiency reports from telephone companies of this era describe operators processing well over 100 calls per hour during peak periods, each one requiring this same combination of instant recall and physical execution. Multiply that across an 8-hour shift, and the total number of individual acts of memory and coordination Eleanor performs in a single night runs into the many hundreds, each one small, each one seemingly trivial in isolation, and each one demanding a level of unbroken concentration that would exhaust almost anyone if sustained for the length of time the job actually required. What this produces by the later hours of a shift is a specific and cumulative form of mental fatigue that has nothing to do with physical tiredness, though the physical tiredness is present as well. It is the fatigue of a mind that has been required for 6 or 7 consecutive hours to hold an enormous amount of specific information in instant, accessible readiness, never permitted to relax its grip on that information, because the next call could arrive at any second and would require it immediately. Eleanor describes this feeling, on the rare occasions she has tried to describe it at all, as a kind of pressure behind the eyes, a sense of her own attention being stretched thin across too many small, urgent demands at once, with no moment available in which to simply let her mind go quiet. She is, in the fullest and most literal sense available to 1934, a human search engine, a living index of names and numbers and locations, queried hundreds of times a night, required to return an instant, accurate result every single time, with no capacity for the kind of momentary lapse that any human memory, under different circumstances, would be permitted. The training for this aspect of the job was, in its own way, more informal than the training for the physical mechanics of the board, and precisely because of that informality, it demanded something closer to raw, unaided memorization than any of the other skills the company required. New operators were given a printed directory to study during their off hours, encouraged to commit as much of it as possible to memory before their first solo shift. And Eleanor recalls spending long evenings during her first month on the job, sitting at the kitchen table with the directory open in front of her, reciting names and numbers under her breath, the way a schoolchild might recite multiplication tables. Her mother occasionally glancing over with a mixture of sympathy and mild bemusement at the sheer scale of what her daughter was attempting to hold in her head. What made the task even more demanding than simple rote memorization was the fact that the directory itself was never static. Subscribers moved, new lines were installed, businesses changed their names or closed entirely. Eleanor was expected not only to memorize the directory as it existed on her first day, but to continuously update her own internal version of it as changes occurred, often learning of a change only when a caller's request revealed it, a name that no longer matched the line she expected, a business that had quietly gone under and was not answering at all. She absorbed these updates the way a person absorbs the changing details of a neighborhood they walk through every day, incrementally, almost without conscious effort, until the total picture in her head bore only a loose resemblance to the printed directory she had originally studied, having been overwritten many times over by 2 years of direct, lived correction. The company measured none of this directly. There was no metric in its efficiency studies for the sheer volume of information an operator was expected to hold in continuous, error-free readiness. The only measurement that mattered was the speed and accuracy of the final connection. And speed and accuracy were treated in every internal report Eleanor has ever heard referenced by a supervisor as though they were purely mechanical outputs, divorced from the invisible cognitive labor that produced them. An operator who connected a call quickly and correctly was, by the company's own logic, simply doing her job competently. The company had no formal acknowledgement anywhere in its training literature of the fact that this competence rested on an act of sustained human memory that would have been considered, in almost any other context, a remarkable feat. There is a particular pride Eleanor has taken, quietly and without ever voicing it to anyone, in the sheer scope of what she has come to hold in her memory. She knows, without needing to consult the directory, that the Hendersons' line runs busy most evenings between 6 and 7, because Mrs. Henderson's sister calls at that hour nearly every day to discuss the same handful of subjects. She knows that the grocer on 5th Street closes his line promptly at 8 and will not answer after that hour, no matter how many times a caller tries. She knows which families have recently installed a line and which have had theirs disconnected for want of payment, information that reaches her not through any official notice, but through the accumulated pattern of calls attempted and calls that go unanswered, a kind of ambient social knowledge that she absorbs simply by virtue of sitting at the center of the exchange's entire flow of communication, night after night, for 2 years running. This knowledge has no name in the company's training manuals, no formal recognition anywhere in her job description, and yet it is, in its own quiet way, one of the most quietly impressive accomplishments of her working life. An entire social map of a city's telephone-owning population held complete and current inside a single 22-year-old mind. For Eleanor, the actual physical execution of a call presented a particular challenge on a night like this one, because the choreography of the board, once you understand its full sequence, turns out to be considerably more demanding than the simple word plugging suggests. Here is the full sequence, the one Eleanor performs in slightly varying form hundreds of times over the course of a single shift. A light flashes on the board, indicating an incoming call on a specific subscriber line. Eleanor identifies which line has flashed among the dozens or hundreds arranged in front of her and reaches for the corresponding answering cord, a flexible cable ending in a metal plug that she inserts into the jack under the flashing light. She presses a small key or switch to open the connection, and speaks her approved greeting, asking the caller for the number or name they wish to reach. The caller answers. Eleanor must now locate, among the hundreds of identical jacks arrayed across the board, the specific jack corresponding to the requested destination, and she must do this quickly, because a pause here reads to the caller as delay and reads to any supervisor listening as inefficiency. Once she has located the destination jack, she takes up a second cord, the ringing cord, connected to the same answering plug through the equipment under the board, and inserts it into the destination jack. She presses a key that sends a ringing signal down the line to alert the person being called. She waits, monitoring for the moment the receiving party lifts their receiver, at which point she completes the connection and withdraws from the call entirely, her presence no longer required, the two parties now speaking directly to one another, through the physical bridge her own hands have just constructed. The entire sequence, from the initial flash of light to the completed connection, is expected to take a matter of seconds. Company efficiency standards of the era specified exact target times for call completion, and supervisors were trained to note and record any operator whose average completion time exceeded the standard. During a peak calling period, Eleanor might process well over 100 of these sequences in a single hour, meaning the time available for any single connection, when the hour is busy, narrows to a matter of a few seconds per call. Every step of the choreography compressed into a window, barely long enough to complete the physical motions required. The physical toll of this repeated motion is specific and cumulative. The cords themselves are heavy, coated rubber over a metal core, and Eleanor's hands, over the course of a shift, handle hundreds of them, gripping, inserting, withdrawing, gripping again. The callus along the side of her right index finger, mentioned earlier, is the direct physical evidence of this repetition, a permanent thickening of skin produced by 2 years of the same small motion, performed thousands of times a week. Her wrists ache by the later hours of a difficult shift, a dull, cumulative strain from the repeated flexing and rotating required to seat a plug correctly in a jack, a strain that has no name in 1934, but that a modern physician would recognize immediately as a form of repetitive strain injury, the same category of harm that affects a modern worker performing thousands of identical keystrokes or clicks across an 8-hour shift. The precision required compounds the physical demand. The jacks on the board are small and closely spaced, and a plug inserted incorrectly, seated at a slight angle or not pushed fully home, produces a bad connection, a call that drops or crackles or fails entirely. And a bad connection is exactly the kind of error a supervisor is trained to notice and record. Eleanor cannot simply jam the cord into the general vicinity of the correct jack. She must seat it precisely, every time, at speed, hundreds of times a night. And the margin for error the job allows her is close to none. By the 4th or 5th hour of a shift, Eleanor's hands have developed a particular, practiced numbness. Not a loss of sensation exactly, but a kind of dulling. The fine motor precision the job demands continuing to function correctly, even as the underlying sensation in her fingers has begun to recede into the background of her awareness. She does not consciously think about each individual motion anymore. The choreography has become, after 2 years, something closer to reflex. And this is precisely what the company intends. Because an operator who must consciously think through each step of the sequence is an operator too slow to meet the standard. And the standard, once again, is the only variable the company's efficiency studies were ever designed to optimize. Industrial efficiency experts, the same kind of consultants who studied factory assembly lines during this period, were regularly brought in by larger telephone companies to time and refine the exact sequence of motions an operator performed at the board, breaking the choreography down into its smallest component parts, the way a factory engineer might study the motions of a worker on an assembly line, searching for fractions of a second that could be trimmed from the sequence through a slightly different hand position or a slightly shortened reach. Eleanor's own exchange underwent one such study during her first year on the job. A quiet, serious man spending several days observing the operators from a chair positioned at the end of the board, making notes, occasionally asking an operator to repeat a specific motion several times while he watched closely. The recommendations that came out of that study, communicated to the operator's second hand through their supervisors, involved minor adjustments to the height of certain jack positions and a slightly revised sequence for handling calls to the busiest lines. Changes that shaved, by the company's own estimate, perhaps 2 or 3 seconds off the average connection time across the exchange as a whole. Eleanor absorbed these adjustments the way she absorbed every other instruction handed down from above, without particular comment, because there was no forum in which her own experience of the work, the ache in her wrist, the particular strain of the revised sequence on her already strained shoulder, would have been considered relevant input to the study. The efficiency expert measured seconds. He did not measure the cumulative toll of those seconds, repeated hundreds of times a night, on the body performing them. The wrist strain in particular has become, over her 2 years at the board, something Eleanor manages rather than something she expects to resolve. On the worst nights, usually toward the end of a particularly busy shift, she notices a faint tremor in her right hand as she reaches for a cord, a small, involuntary shake that passes within a few seconds, but that she has come to recognize as a signal her body is sending about the cumulative strain of the night, a signal with no acknowledged remedy available to her beyond simply continuing until the shift ends and the strain has a chance to ease overnight before the cycle resumes the following evening. She has mentioned this tremor to exactly one person, an older operator on the day shift named Constance, who nodded with the particular, unsurprised recognition of someone who has experienced the identical symptom herself, and who offered, as her only piece of advice, that Eleanor should try to alternate slightly which fingers bear the brunt of the gripping motion when she is able, a small, informal adaptation passed woman to woman, entirely outside any official channel, because the official channels have never once acknowledged that the wrist strain exists as a problem worth addressing. The supervisor's watch, meanwhile, was its own ongoing negotiation, one that ran silently beneath every single call Eleanor completed. The supervisor on Eleanor's shift is a woman named Mrs. Adelaide Pruitt, herself a former operator promoted several years ago into the oversight role, and Mrs. Pruitt's job, for the full 8 hours of the shift, consists almost entirely of watching. She walks the length of the aisle behind the switchboard at irregular intervals, never announcing when she is about to pass, carrying a small notebook and a stopwatch that she uses to time the interval between an incoming light and a completed connection. An operator whose average time exceeds the company standard is noted in the book. A pattern of noted delays becomes a conversation, held privately, in which the operator's continued employment is made to feel, however gently the conversation is phrased, conditional on improvement. But the stopwatch, uncomfortable as it is, was not the most invasive aspect of the supervisor's oversight. The company also employed a practice known internally as service observation, in which a supervisor could connect silently to any operator's line at any moment without warning and listen to the call in progress, without either party on the actual call being aware that a third person was present. Eleanor has known since her first week of training that any call she handles at any hour could be silently monitored in this way, and she has no way of knowing, in the moment, whether a given call is or is not being observed. The effect of this uncertainty is precisely what the company intended it to be. Eleanor maintains the trained voice with a smile on every single call, without exception. Because the alternative, letting her guard down on a call she assumes is unmonitored, only to discover it was the one call Mrs. Pruitt happened to be listening to, carries a real professional cost. The result is a form of continuous, low-grade vigilance that never fully switches off, a permanent awareness that she may be observed at any moment, which functions, whether or not anyone at the company ever used this specific language, as a kind of psychological pressure considerably more effective than direct supervision could ever be, because direct supervision only constrains behavior while the supervisor is visibly present, while the possibility of unseen observation constrains behavior at all times, whether anyone is actually listening or not. Eleanor experienced this directly several months into the job during a call from an elderly man who had misdialed and grown confused and increasingly agitated when Eleanor tried to redirect him to the correct number. She maintained her trained tone throughout, patient, warm, unhurried, even as the man's confusion stretched the call well past the time efficiency standards allowed. She learned afterward, from a brief comment Mrs. Pruitt made in passing, that the call had in fact been observed and that her handling of it had been noted favorably. She has never forgotten the small, cold jolt of realizing, after the fact, that she had been watched during a moment she believed to be private, and the realization changed nothing about her behavior going forward, because her behavior had already been, on every single call, exactly what it would have been under direct observation. That was the entire design of the system. It did not require constant actual watching. It required only the permanent possibility of it, installed so thoroughly in an operator's mind that the watching became, in effect, continuous, whether a supervisor happened to be listening in that particular moment or not. Mrs. Pruitt herself is not, in Eleanor's private assessment, an unkind woman. She has worked the boards herself years ago and carries her own faded groove across the tops of her ears, a fact Eleanor noticed early on and has thought about more than once during the long hours of a quiet shift. Mrs. Pruitt enforces the rules with a consistency that suggests she truly believes in their purpose, that she understands the stopwatch and the silent listening as the mechanism by which the exchange maintains a standard of service that, in her own mind, justifies the discomfort it produces. Whether this belief is correct, whether the marginal gains in efficiency the company's studies claim to demonstrate are actually worth the toll extracted from the women producing them, is a question that falls entirely outside the scope of Mrs. Pruitt's role, and outside the scope of the training that shaped her into a supervisor in the first place. She was, in her own way, produced by the same system that now produces Eleanor, promoted upward through it rather than freed from it, carrying its logic forward into her own management of the operators beneath her, because she has never been given any other logic to carry forward instead. The particular cruelty of the arrangement, if cruelty is even the right word for a system built this impersonally, is that it recruits its own victims into its continuation. Mrs. Pruitt does not experience herself as an instrument of oppression. She experiences herself as a competent professional, doing a necessary job, maintaining standards that keep the exchange running smoothly, and, in a narrow, technical sense, she is entirely correct. The stopwatch does produce faster connections. The silent listening does maintain a more consistent tone across the exchange floor. What the system never asks, at any level from the efficiency consultant down to the individual supervisor, is whether the faster connections and the consistent tone are worth what they cost the young women whose bodies and voices and nervous systems absorb the entire burden of producing them. The service observation practice itself was not unique to Eleanor's particular exchange. Telephone companies across the country had, by the early 1930s, adopted some version of silent monitoring as a standard tool of quality control, and several had gone further still, installing recording equipment on selected lines to capture sample calls for later review by training staff, who would use the recordings to identify operators whose tone or technique fell short of the approved standard. Eleanor's own exchange did not yet have this recording capability, a fact she has heard mentioned, with a mixture of relief and unease, by an operator who transferred in from a larger city exchange that did. The prospect of a call being not merely overheard in the moment, but preserved, replayed, and analysed at length by a training supervisor searching for flaws in her tone, struck Eleanor, when she first heard of it, as a violation of a slightly different order than the live listening she had already grown accustomed to, though she found it difficult to articulate exactly why. A recorded voice felt more exposed than a voice merely overheard once and then, presumably, forgotten. What both practices shared, whether live or recorded, was the same underlying premise: that an operator's voice belonged, in some meaningful sense, to the company rather than to herself, subject to inspection and correction at any moment the company chose to exercise that right, with no reciprocal obligation on the company's part to inform her when the inspection was occurring, or to justify, beyond the bare assertion of quality control, why her voice required such continuous scrutiny in the first place. There is a particular kind of intimacy that came with this job, one the company never acknowledged, never trained her for. And it is the piece of the work that Eleanor has found hardest to carry. An operator connecting a call in the brief seconds before she withdraws from the line hears the very beginning of whatever conversation is about to unfold. Most of the time, this is nothing: a number requested, a greeting exchanged, the ordinary texture of daily life passing briefly through her hands and immediately forgotten. But some of the time, in a job that processes hundreds of calls a night across a period of years, an operator's brief window into a conversation lands on something else entirely. Eleanor has connected calls that opened with a voice breaking the news of a death. She has connected calls where the first words she heard before she withdrew were a man asking a doctor to come quickly, his own voice cracking with a fear that was unmistakable, even in the 2 or 3 seconds before she left the line. She's connected calls where a young woman's voice, hushed and urgent, asked to speak to someone, in a tone that made clear the conversation about to follow was not one meant for other ears. A secret being carried down the wire to exactly one intended listener, with Eleanor, invisible and unacknowledged, having heard the very door of it swing open before she closed it behind her. The company's position on this was explicit and absolute. Whatever an operator heard in the seconds she was present on a line, she was bound to forget, instantly and completely. Operators were made to understand from the earliest days of training that any repetition of overheard information, whether shared with a friend, a family member, or another operator, constituted grounds for immediate dismissal. And beyond the threat of dismissal, there was an internalized professional ethic that most operators, Eleanor included, took seriously in its own right. A genuine sense that the trust placed in them by every caller who dialed a number, never imagining a stranger would hear even a fragment of what followed, demanded to be honored. But instructed forgetting and actual forgetting are not the same thing, and Eleanor has learned this distinction the hard way on more than one occasion. She heard births. She heard deaths. She heard secrets she was sworn to erase from her own memory the instant she withdrew from the line, and she has found, across 2 years of this work, that the erasure the company demanded of her was considerably easier to promise than to actually perform. The call she remembers most clearly, though she has never told anyone about it and never will, came several months ago, in the deep hours of a night shift much like this one. A young woman, her voice thin and shaking, asked to be connected to a number Eleanor recognized as a doctor's private line, the kind of number that is not requested lightly at 3 a.m. In the brief seconds before Eleanor withdrew, she heard enough of the opening exchange to understand, with a clarity she did not want, exactly what kind of trouble the young woman was in, and exactly how alone she sounded, asking for help with it. Eleanor completed the connection, as her training required, and withdrew from the line, as her training required. And she has thought about that voice, unbidden, at odd moments ever since, with no way of ever learning what became of her, no permission to ask, no one she could tell even if she wanted to. The entire fragment of another woman's crisis existing now only inside Eleanor's own memory, carried and never spoken of. A weight she volunteered for the day she took this job, without having any clear idea of what she was agreeing to carry. This is, perhaps, the least visible cost of the entire profession, and the one the promotional photograph could never begin to capture. Eleanor is required to process an almost continuous stream of fragmented human experience, joy and grief and fear and desperation, arriving through her headset in disconnected pieces, never given the context that would follow in a normal human conversation, never permitted to ask a follow-up question or offer a word of comfort, never allowed to be anything other than a silent, momentary presence who appears for a handful of seconds before vanishing from the line entirely. She absorbs the emotional weight of hundreds of other people's most significant moments, and she is expected to carry none of it forward, to feel nothing that lingers, to remain, on the next call and the call after that, exactly as cheerful and exactly as composed as she was in the very first call of the shift. There is no formal acknowledgement anywhere in the company's training materials that this aspect of the job exists at all, let alone that it might carry a genuine psychological cost. The training addresses confidentiality purely as a matter of professional conduct, a rule to be followed, with no attention whatsoever to the fact that following the rule requires an operator to process real human suffering without any of the normal outlets, without the ability to discuss it, process it, or even fully acknowledge to herself that she's been affected by it, since acknowledging the effect would mean admitting that she remembers what she was instructed to forget. Eleanor has developed her own private method for managing this, though she has never named it or discussed it with anyone, because there was never anyone to discuss it with. On the nights when a particular call has left her unsettled, she has learned to hold the feeling at a slight distance, acknowledging it exists without allowing herself to sit with it fully. A kind of practiced compartmentalization that she suspects, though she has no language to confirm it, is shared by every operator who has worked the boards long enough to encounter this side of the job more than once. Ruth, the operator a few positions down the board, whom Eleanor is not permitted to speak with during a shift, has, on rare occasions during their brief shared break, let a comment slip that suggested she carries her own version of the same private weight. A passing remark about a difficult night, offered and then immediately withdrawn behind a change of subject, the two women recognizing something in each other, without either of them ever finding the words or the permission to discuss it directly. What the job asks of Eleanor in this specific dimension is something closer to what might be asked of a nurse or a clergyman, a person routinely present at the edges of other people's most significant moments, expected to absorb the emotional weight of that presence without allowing it to show, without letting it interfere with the next task at hand. The difference is that a nurse or a clergyman is generally understood by the culture around them to be doing something genuinely difficult, something that carries its own dignity and its own acknowledged toll. Eleanor is understood by the culture around her to be doing something pleasant and unremarkable, a polite young woman connecting telephone calls. And the total mismatch between what the job actually demands of her emotionally and what the public imagines it demands is, in its own way, as significant a form of concealment as anything else this video has described. There is a particular category of call that Eleanor has come, over 2 years, to dread more than any other. Not the emergencies, which at least carry the clarity of a specific, actionable task, but the calls in which someone breaks down mid-conversation after she has already completed the connection and technically withdrawn from the line. Calls where her hand still rests near the plug and her attention whether she wants it to or not, catches the first raw, unguarded sound of someone's composure giving way before she can fully disengage. She has learned to withdraw a fraction of a second faster on calls that seem headed in this direction, a small, practiced flinch away from overhearing more than she is required to, though she cannot always manage it in time. And the sounds she has caught in that fraction of a second, a sob suppressed, a voice breaking on a single word, have stayed with her in a way that the more clearly categorized emergencies somehow have not. Perhaps because an emergency at least resolves into a known shape, while a moment of private grief, caught only in its opening half-second, resolves into nothing at all. An open wound she carries without ever learning how or whether it eventually closed. Eleanor has never spoken of any specific call to her mother or her sister, though she has on a few occasions come close. Sitting at the family table on a rare shared evening, the words rising in her throat before she pushes them back down, reminding herself of the rule she swore to uphold, and reminding herself, too, of the simpler fact that there would be no comfort in the telling anyway. No way to describe the specific weight of an overheard fragment without the description itself becoming a kind of further violation of the very confidentiality she is trying to honor. She carries what she carries alone, the way every operator on every exchange in the country carries some version of the same private archive, an archive that will exist nowhere on paper, that will die with each woman who held it, unrecorded and unacknowledged, the exact human cost of a service the public experienced as effortless. If the daytime exchange was frantic, the deep night was something else entirely, and it took Eleanor most of her first year to understand exactly what that difference actually felt like from the inside. By 1 o'clock in the morning, on a typical night, the volume of calls has thinned to a fraction of what it was during the evening hours. The board that was, at 9 o'clock, a chaotic field of flashing lights and constant motion becomes, by the deep night hours, a long, dark expanse of quiet brass sockets, punctuated only occasionally by a single, sudden light appearing somewhere along its length, demanding attention in a room that has otherwise gone almost entirely still. This should, in theory, be easier than the frantic pace of the day shift. In practice, Eleanor has found it to be its own distinct and considerable challenge, one that the company's efficiency studies, focused entirely on call volume and connection speed, never seem to have accounted for. The problem is not overwork. The problem is the opposite. The problem is remaining fully alert for hour after hour in a dim, quiet room at an hour when every instinct in a human body is oriented towards sleep, waiting for a single light that might not appear again for 20 minutes, and that, when it does appear, will require an instant, precise response, with no margin for the sluggishness that naturally accompanies deep fatigue at 3 in the morning. Eleanor fights this every single night. The exchange room at this hour is lit only by the row of hanging bulbs overhead, dimmed somewhat compared to the daytime brightness, and the long wall of the switchboard sits mostly dark, its hundreds of small lights unlit, waiting. She has learned small tricks to keep herself alert during the emptiest stretches, shifting her posture slightly every few minutes, pressing the tip of her tongue against the back of her teeth, a habit she developed without meaning to, that seems to keep some thin thread of alertness active in a mind otherwise drifting toward the edge of sleep. She keeps her eyes moving steadily across the length of the dark board, rather than letting them settle and glaze on any single point, because a fixed stare, she learned early, is the fastest route to actually nodding off, even while sitting upright with the headset clamped to her ears. The silence of the room at this hour carries its own particular texture. There is the low, continuous hum of the equipment itself, a sound so constant that Eleanor has long since stopped consciously hearing it, though she would notice its absence instantly if it ever stopped. There is the occasional creak of the wooden chair under her as she shifts position. There is, very rarely, a quiet cough or the soft rustle of fabric from one of the other operators, working the same deep shift a few positions down the board. A woman, named Ruth, whom Eleanor is not permitted to speak to, but has come over many shared nights to feel something like genuine companionship toward, expressed entirely through small, silent gestures. A glance exchanged when a supervisor's back is turned, a brief, tired smile passed between two women who understand exactly what the other is enduring without either of them ever being permitted to say so aloud. Ruth and Eleanor have worked the same rotation for the better part of a year now, and in that time, an entire relationship has formed between them that exists almost entirely in glances and small, silent signals, a form of communication neither of them ever consciously decided to develop, but that emerged, gradually, out of sheer proximity and shared circumstance. Eleanor knows, without either of them ever having spoken it directly, which nights are harder for Ruth than others, recognizing a particular tightness around her eyes that signals a difficult call has just passed through her line. The same tightness Eleanor herself no doubt wears on her own harder nights. On one occasion, several months ago, during the brief permitted break the two women happened to take at the same moment, standing several feet apart in the small anteroom because even the break allowed no closer proximity than that, Ruth said only 4 words. "Long night, isn't it?" And Eleanor answered only 2. "It certainly is." And in that brief, permitted exchange, so far short of the actual conversation either of them might have wanted, an entire understanding passed between them. The closest thing to genuine human connection the structure of their shared work has ever allowed. This is the profound isolation of the night operator, a loneliness that has nothing to do with being physically alone, because Eleanor is rarely, if ever, fully alone in the room, and everything to do with being the only, fully waking, fully attentive presence in a building that otherwise sits dark and still, tethered by copper wire to an entire city of people who are, at this hour, almost universally asleep. She sits at the center of a vast, silent network, aware, in an abstract way, that somewhere out there, across the whole sleeping expanse of the city, a single person might, at any moment, lift a receiver and need her. Immediately, completely alert, ready to respond within seconds despite the 4 hours of near total stillness that may have preceded that single call. The strain of maintaining this state, hour after hour, is a distinct kind of exhaustion, different from the physical ache of the headset or the mental load of the daytime call volume. It is the exhaustion of sustained readiness against long odds, of holding oneself in a state of alert attention that is, for the vast majority of any given hour, entirely unrewarded by any actual demand on that attention. And Eleanor has come to understand, across 2 years of these shifts, that this particular kind of tiredness, the tiredness of waiting rather than working, is in some ways harder to recover from than the more obvious physical fatigue of a busy shift, because there is no visible activity to point to as its cause, only the quiet, accumulating weight of hour after hour spent fighting her own body's plain and reasonable desire to sleep. There is a specific hour, somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, that Eleanor has come to think of privately as the hardest stretch of the entire shift. Harder even than the final exhausted hours before dawn, because by 4 or 5 o'clock, there is at least the growing anticipation of the shift's end to draw on, some small reserve of motivation generated by the approaching relief. The 2 o'clock hour offers no such comfort. It sits at the deepest point of the night, farthest from both the memory of the shift's beginning and the promise of its end. And it is during this hour that Eleanor's body seems to fight hardest against her, a heaviness settling behind her eyes that she has learned to recognize as the specific, distinct sensation of a mind trying, against her explicit will, to drift towards sleep, while her body remains upright and technically alert. She has developed, over 2 years, an entire private repertoire of small physical tricks for surviving this hour. Pressing her thumbnail lightly into the pad of her opposite index finger, a small, precise discomfort that seems to sharpen her attention for a few minutes at a time. Shifting her weight slowly from one hip to the other every so often, never enough to be visible to a supervisor walking the aisle, just enough to keep some faint signal of movement traveling through her body. Counting, silently, the number of unlit jacks in a given section of the board, a meaningless exercise that nonetheless seems to occupy just enough of her mind to keep it from sliding fully toward drowsiness. None of these tricks were taught to her. She invented them, independently, out of raw necessity, the way she suspects every operator who has worked this particular hour for long enough eventually invents some private version of the same defenses, none of it acknowledged anywhere in the company's training literature. Because the company's training literature assumes, implicitly, that alertness is simply a matter of will, rather than an active, ongoing battle against the deepest physiological rhythms of the human body. The quiet of the room at this hour also plays its own particular trick on the mind. In the absence of any external demand, Eleanor's thoughts drift, unbidden, toward whatever she has not had time to think about during the busier hours of the shift. And on many nights, this means the calls that unsettled her, the ones described earlier, resurfacing now in the stillness with a clarity they did not have in the rushed moment they actually occurred. She has learned to let these thoughts pass through rather than fighting them directly, a kind of quiet, private vigil held in the emptiest hours of the night. For the voices she is not permitted to remember and cannot quite manage to forget. Which raises the question of what exactly does happen on that dark board at 3 a.m. Because something does happen on nearly every shift, and the range of what comes through in those hours is wider and stranger than the daytime volume of ordinary business calls would ever suggest. There are the emergencies, a house fire, a sudden collapse, a woman in early, frightened labor with her husband away and no one else in the house to help her. These calls arrive without warning, at any hour. And Eleanor has learned to recognize the particular urgency in a caller's voice within the first half-second of a connection, a pitch and pace entirely distinct from an ordinary request. And she has learned to respond to that urgency with a speed that overrides, briefly, every other rule of the trained, measured pace the company otherwise requires. There is no ambulance service to dial directly in 1934 in the way a modern caller would understand it. There is only Eleanor, connecting the frightened voice to the doctor, or to the fire department's line, or to whatever specific number the emergency requires, as quickly as her hands and her memory allow, fully aware in these moments that the seconds she saves or loses carry consequences considerably heavier than a supervisor's efficiency rating. There are the doctors themselves, called at all hours by patients and by other doctors. Their calls carrying a particular weight and priority that Eleanor has learned to recognize and prioritize without needing to be told. A professional courtesy extended not because company policy explicitly requires it, but because she understands, in a way the company's efficiency manuals never quite articulate, that a doctor's line ringing at 3 a.m. is very rarely a trivial matter. There are the lonely callers. These arrive less frequently, but with a consistency that has become, over 2 years, entirely familiar to Eleanor. A person, usually alone, usually older, who dials the operator not because they need a specific number connected, but because they want, simply, to hear another human voice at an hour when the rest of the world has gone silent around them. Company policy is unambiguous on how these calls should be handled. Eleanor is not permitted to linger, not permitted to engage beyond the bounds of her approved phrases, And she has, on more than one occasion, gently and briskly redirected a caller who seemed to want nothing more than a few extra seconds of conversation, following the rule precisely as she is required to, and feeling afterward a small, private discomfort about it that she has never mentioned to anyone. A sense that she has just closed the door on someone who needed, more than anything else in that moment, simply not to be alone. There was one caller in particular, an elderly widower who dialed the operator's line perhaps once every few weeks, always in the deepest hours of the night. Always with some minor, faintly manufactured pretext, a question about the correct number for a business that had closed months earlier, a request to be connected to a relative he had, Eleanor suspected, no genuine urgent need to reach at that specific hour. She recognized his voice after the second or third occurrence, and though company policy required her to treat each call with the same brisk efficiency as any other, she found herself, within the narrow bounds the rules allowed, holding the connection a fraction of a second longer than strictly necessary before redirecting him, offering the smallest possible extension of presence that her training would permit. She has no way of knowing what became of him. He simply stopped calling some months ago now, and she has never learned whether this meant he found some other source of company in his nights, or whether it meant something considerably more final. And the not knowing sits with her in the same quiet, unresolved way as so much else this job has asked her to carry and release without ever learning the ending. There are the drunks, callers whose speech is slurred, whose requests are incoherent or repeated, who sometimes grow belligerent when Eleanor cannot make sense of what they are asking for. She has been sworn at, more than once, by a man too intoxicated to remember the number he was trying to reach. And her training holds in these moments exactly as it holds in every other moment. The same trained warmth, the same measured patience, regardless of what she is actually feeling as the words land on her. And there are the wrong numbers, the misdials, the calls that connect to a stranger and end within seconds, apologetic and unremarkable. The ordinary static of a system operated by human memory and human hands, rather than the flawless precision of a machine. Tonight, in the hours after 2, Eleanor takes a call from a man whose voice she does not recognize, asking to be connected to a doctor's line she knows well. And something in his tone, tight and controlled in a way that suggests real effort to remain calm, tells her this is not a routine request. She completes the connection in seconds, faster than her trained pace even requires, and she does not know, and will likely never know, what the outcome of that call was. Whether the person on the other end of the line lived through whatever crisis prompted it, whether the doctor arrived in time, whether the story resolved into relief or into grief. She simply connects the call, withdraws, and returns her attention to the dark, quiet board. Because the next light might flash at any moment, and her job, regardless of what she has just been part of, is to be ready for it. This is the shape of the deep night shift, long stretches of near total stillness, broken by moments of real human consequence, arriving without warning, processed in seconds, and then released entirely from Eleanor's hands. The outcome forever unknown to her. The next call already demanding her full attention before she has had a single moment to consider what the last one might have meant. The company's own records from this period, in the rare instances they survive and have been studied by historians, reveal something Eleanor herself has never had occasion to see stated so plainly. That the night shift, despite carrying a far lower call volume than the daytime hours, was consistently associated with higher rates of operator turnover and a greater number of reported instances of what supervisors of the era described, in the clipped language of internal memoranda, as nervous strain. The company's own solution to this pattern was not to reduce the demands of the night shift, but to rotate operators through it more frequently, on the theory that no single operator should be exposed to its particular strain for too long a stretch of her career. A policy that reads, from a modern vantage point, as a tacit acknowledgement that the night shift extracted something from an operator that the company itself understood, however dimly, could not be sustained indefinitely, even as it declined to change anything about the shift's actual structure or demands. Eleanor has been on this rotation for 8 months now, longer than the company's typical interval, kept in place partly because Mrs. Pruitt has come to trust her judgment during the deep hours, and partly because Eleanor herself, when quietly asked the one time the subject came up, said she did not mind the night shift particularly, a statement she made honestly, in the sense that she did not, in truth, experience the same acute distress some of the other operators reported, but a statement that did not capture, because she had no occasion or vocabulary to capture it, the specific, cumulative toll the shift has nonetheless been extracting from her in its own quieter, less dramatic way, month after month. The toll of interrupted sleep patterns and persistent daytime fatigue, and a general sense of being slightly unmoored from the ordinary rhythm of the world that she has simply come to accept as the permanent condition of her working life. Dawn arrives slowly through the high, frosted windows near the ceiling of the exchange room, the darkness outside easing first into a deep grey, gradually taking on something with actual colour in it, a thin, watery light that Eleanor has watched arrive so many times now that she can estimate the hour almost precisely, just from the particular shade of grey visible through the glass. The morning shift begins to arrive a little before 7. Eleanor hears the outer door open, hears the muffled sound of coats being hung and greetings exchanged in the small anteroom outside the exchange floor, and a woman named Frances, who works the 7 to 3 shift, appears at the empty position beside her, ready to take over the board. The handoff itself is brief and procedural. Eleanor notes for Frances anything unusual from the night, a line that has been giving trouble, a subscriber who called in with a complaint that needs following up. Frances nods, settles into the chair Eleanor is about to vacate, and reaches for her own headset. And then, finally, the moment Eleanor has been moving toward for 8 hours arrives. She reaches up with both hands and lifts the heavy steel band away from her head, and the relief of it is immediate and physical. A rush of blood and sensation returning to the tops of her ears the instant the pressure releases, a small, private wave of comfort that she has come to treasure more than almost any other single moment in her entire working day. She rubs the side of her neck, stiff from 8 hours of rigid posture, and rolls her shoulders and stands up from the plain wooden chair and feels her spine settle into a posture that is, for the first time since 11 o'clock the previous night, actually her own rather than the company's. She retrieves her coat. She walks the short hallway toward the exchange building's front entrance, and the heavy door closes behind her with its familiar weight. And she steps outside, into the cool morning air of the city, and the ozone smell of the exchange room, the hot, electrical wiring smell that has clung to the inside of her nose for 8 hours, begins to clear almost immediately, replaced by the plainer, cooler smell of a November morning. Wood smoke somewhere in the distance, damp pavement, the ordinary air of a city just beginning to wake. The streets, at this hour, carry their own particular population. Milk delivery wagons making their rounds, a handful of early workers heading toward factory shifts, a paperboy folding additions on a corner. Eleanor walks among them in the strange, suspended state of someone whose day is ending just as everyone else's is beginning. And there is something in this daily inversion that she has never fully gotten used to, a persistent, quiet sense of being slightly out of step with the rhythm of the world around her. She passes, most mornings, a small bakery 2 streets from her boarding house, just opening for the day. the smell of fresh bread reaching her before she is close enough to see the lights inside. And this smell has become, over her 2 years on the night rotation, one of the small, reliable markers that tells her body the shift is truly over. More reliable in its way than the clock itself, a signal absorbed through scent rather than sight that seems to reach some older, more primitive part of her attention than the conscious awareness of the time. She sometimes buys a single roll on these mornings when she has a few coins to spare, eating it slowly on the remaining walk home, the first food she has had since a hurried meal at the midpoint of her shift. And there is a particular, uncomplicated pleasure in this small ritual that stands in sharp contrast to everything the preceding 8 hours have demanded of her. A pleasure entirely her own, requiring no performance, observed by no supervisor, existing for no purpose beyond the simple fact that the bread is warm and she is hungry, and the morning, for these few minutes, belongs entirely to her. Her boarding house room, when she reaches it, is small and plain and, above all else, silent. She closes the door behind her, and the silence that settles over the room is total. A silence with no hum of equipment under it, no supervisor's footsteps, no sudden flash of light demanding an instant response. She sits on the edge of her bed. She reaches into the pocket of her uniform, still worn under her coat, and touches the small paper fan with its faded cornflowers, confirming, as she does most mornings, that it is still there. There is a particular ritual to the way Eleanor decompresses after a night shift, developed gradually over 2 years without her ever consciously deciding to develop it. She removes her shoes first, always, before anything else, and stands for a moment, simply feeling the give of the floorboards under her stocking feet after 8 hours in the flat, unyielding leather her uniform requires. She unpins her hair next, working the pins loose one at a time and setting them in a small dish on the dresser, feeling the slight, welcome ache of her scalp finally released from the tight, low style the company prefers. She runs her fingers through her hair, loosened now, and rubs at her temples. And only then does she begin the longer process of unbuttoning the stiff uniform collar and changing into the plain cotton nightdress that hangs on a hook behind her door. Her landlady, Mrs. Kessler, has learned over the 2 years Eleanor has boarded with her exactly what the routine of a night shift girl requires, and keeps the house quiet through the morning hours as a matter of unspoken courtesy, the other boarders, mostly daytime workers themselves, having absorbed the same understanding without anyone needing to explain it directly. This small, informal accommodation, this shared agreement among strangers living under one roof that a sleeping night shift worker's rest deserves the same protection as anyone else's, is one of the few places in Eleanor's entire working life where the actual physical tool of her job receives any acknowledgement at all, even if the acknowledgement takes the form only of a quieter household during the daylight hours, rather than any word ever spoken directly about it. She unpins her hair and changes out of the stiff uniform collar and lies down and closes her eyes against the thin daylight now filtering through her window and disconnects, finally and completely, from the voices of 1,000 strangers that have passed through her hands and through her memory over the last 8 hours, none of them ever knowing her name, none of them ever hearing anything of her but a trained, warm, patient voice asking for a number, and now, at last, none of them reaching her at all. Step back for a moment from the specific details. Step back from the headset groove and the trained smile and the silent supervisor and the single light on the dark board, and look at the whole shape of what this job actually required. There is a pattern here, and once you see it, you will see it in every nostalgic image of the switchboard operator you encounter from now on. The first pattern is this: perfect service. The kind the telephone company advertised and the public came to expect required the near total suppression of the person providing it. Eleanor's own feelings, her own fatigue, her own reactions to a difficult caller or a distressing overheard fragment of someone else's crisis were not permitted any expression at all during the 8 hours she sat at that board. The warmth in her voice was real, in the sense that she was a genuinely warm person, but its expression was manufactured, drilled, and monitored until it functioned identically, regardless of what she actually felt in any given moment. The company did not want Eleanor's authentic response to a rude caller or a distressing call. It wanted a consistent, manufactured product, and it built an entire system of training and surveillance specifically to ensure that product never varied, whatever the woman producing it happened to be experiencing underneath. The second pattern is this. The body itself was treated as a component of the equipment it operated, calibrated and monitored with the same rigor the company applied to the switchboard's electrical connections. The headband that grooves the ear, the chair that permits no slouching, the posture required to reach the highest jacks, the rule against crossing legs, all of it reflects a system that regarded Eleanor's physical form primarily as a piece of infrastructure to be optimized for throughput, not fundamentally different in the company's own internal logic from the wiring and the jacks and the cords she operated. Her comfort was never the variable being optimized. Her efficiency was. It is worth sitting for a moment with just how literally this was true. The efficiency consultants who studied the board timed her hand movements the same way they might time a lever on an assembly line. The headset she wore was selected by the same purchasing logic that selected the copper wiring inside the walls, weighed for cost against measurable output, never for the discomfort of the person wearing it. She was, in the company's own operational thinking, a component among components, distinguished from the switching equipment mainly by the fact that she required a wage and occasional sleep, both of which the company provided in the minimum quantity its own studies suggested were necessary to keep the component functioning at the required standard. The third pattern is this. An enormous amount of invisible labor sat behind the smooth, effortless experience the public associated with the telephone service. When a customer in 1934 picked up a receiver and said a name or a number, they experienced something that felt instant and simple, a request made and fulfilled within seconds. What that customer never saw was the trained memory holding hundreds of names in instant readiness, the trained voice suppressing every trace of fatigue or distress, the trained hands executing a precise physical choreography at speed, hundreds of times an hour, and the trained composure absorbing an unbroken stream of other people's births and deaths and emergencies and secrets without ever showing a crack. The technology felt effortless, specifically because an enormous, exhausting, and entirely concealed amount of human effort had been organized to make it feel that way. And the fourth pattern, the one that connects most directly to the world you are sitting in right now, listening to this. The constant surveillance, the demand for cheerfulness regardless of internal state, the monitoring of response times, the total absorption of other people's needs, while one's own needs go entirely unacknowledged. These are not problems the modern world invented. Eleanor Voss experienced a version of digital burnout, workplace surveillance, and emotional labor exhaustion nearly a century before those exact phrases existed, sitting at a wooden chair in a dim exchange room, wearing a groove into her own ears, smiling at a caller who could not see her and would never know her name. There is a fifth pattern worth naming as well, one that connects less to the mechanics of the job itself and more to what it reveals about how a society chooses which forms of labor to see and which to render invisible. The men who built and maintained the physical infrastructure of the telephone network, the linemen who climbed poles in every kind of weather, the engineers who designed the switching equipment, were understood by the culture around them and by the company itself as skilled workers performing genuinely difficult, genuinely valuable labor. Their work was visible, credentialed, and compensated in a manner that reflected its recognized difficulty. Eleanor's labor, despite requiring a comparable degree of trained skill, sustained physical strain and cognitive demand, was categorized instead as a form of naturally occurring feminine aptitude, a pleasant voice and a nimble pair of hands that any suitable young woman happened to possess, requiring little more than basic instruction to activate. This categorization was not accidental. It served the company's interests precisely, because labor, understood as a natural feminine gift, could be compensated at a fraction of what labor understood as a skilled technical trade would command. And an entire industry built its wage structure on this exact distinction, extracting from thousands of young women like Eleanor a level of skilled, demanding performance that it never had to acknowledge, let alone pay for, as skilled or demanding at all. Eleanor herself has never had occasion to think about her job in these terms. She does not think of herself as underpaid relative to the actual difficulty of her work, because she has no other framework available against which to measure it. No union representing operators at her particular exchange, no public conversation in 1934 that treats the switchboard operator's labor as a subject worthy of serious economic analysis. She simply understands that this is what the job pays, and that the job, difficult as it is, remains steadier and more necessary to her family's survival than almost any alternative available to a young woman of her background and education in the middle of a decade defined across the entire country by scarcity and uncertainty. There is, in fact, a small but genuine irony sitting at the center of the entire arrangement, one that Eleanor has never had occasion to name, but that becomes visible the moment you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it. The telephone company built its entire public reputation, its entire brand of modern reliability and effortless connection, on the invisible skill and endurance of women like Eleanor. Women whose actual working conditions the company worked just as hard to keep hidden as it worked to advertise the polish of the service itself. The company needed both things simultaneously: the genuine, extracted competence of thousands of trained operators, and the public's total ignorance of what producing that competence actually required. Neither half of that arrangement could exist without the other, and Eleanor, sitting at her board on a Tuesday night in November, is the living point where both halves meet. Her real, aching, exhausted body producing, night after night, the seamless illusion the company sold to everyone who never had to sit where she sits. Eleanor Voss is not the smiling figure in the company photograph. She is a person who spent 8 hours a night holding an entire city's fragmented human experience in her hands and her memory, absorbing its emergencies and its griefs and its loneliness, required at every moment to present a version of herself that had almost nothing to do with what she actually felt. And doing all of this so that the rest of the world could enjoy the simple, seamless experience of picking up a telephone and being instantly and effortlessly connected. The photograph is still there, of course, filed away somewhere in a company archive. 5 young women in identical postures, identical smiles, identical trained expressions, radiating the calm, capable warmth the telephone company wanted the public to associate with its service. You are looking at Eleanor now with different eyes than you had at the start of this video. You know what the groove on her ears actually means, and what it costs to maintain that trained voice for 8 hours, and what her memory has to hold in constant, instant readiness through an entire shift. You know about Mrs. Pruitt's stopwatch, and the silent, unannounced listening on her lines, and the specific ache in her jaw by midnight from a smile she is required to hold whether or not she feels anything like it underneath. You know about the births and deaths and secrets that have passed through her hands and settled, uninvited, into her memory, carried and never spoken of. You know about the deep, eerie stillness of the 3 a.m. board, and the specific loneliness of being the only fully waking presence in a building tethered to an entire sleeping city, and the small, private relief of finally lifting that heavy steel band away from her ears at the end of it all. You know about the paper fan in her pocket, painted with faded cornflowers, touched but never used. A small, private reminder of a version of herself that existed before the shifts began. Look at the photograph again. She is not the smiling figure the camera captured. She is the person that smile was designed to produce, drilled and monitored and installed on her face for exactly the length of a photograph, and worn, in a slightly different but no less demanding form, for 8 hours every single night. She was not simply a pleasant voice on the other end of the line. She was a memory, a mechanism, a trained emotional performance, and a body absorbing physical strain the company never troubled itself to measure beyond its effect on her call completion times. And she looks composed in that photograph. Not because the composure was easy. Right in the middle of everything this video has described, the groove and the ache and the surveillance and the overheard grief, she held that composure night after night, because the job required it, and because she needed the wage, and because there was, in 1934, very little alternative available to a young woman in her position. Somewhere tonight, whatever invisible emotional labor you performed today, whatever version of a trained, pleasant voice you had to hold for someone who never knew what it cost you, whatever lines of attention and availability you had to keep open long after you wanted to close them, you can finally unplug them now. The board is clear. The lights have gone dark. Nobody is listening in anymore, timing your response, waiting for the next flash to demand your instant, composed attention. Consider for a moment everything that has changed in the years since Eleanor sat in that chair, and everything that has not. The switchboards themselves disappeared decades ago, replaced first by automatic dialing systems, and eventually by the small device many of you are perhaps holding right now, listening to this through a pair of earbuds instead of a steel-banded headset. The specific physical tool Eleanor carried, the grooved ears, the streamed shoulders, the calloused finger, belongs entirely to a technology that no longer exists. But the underlying structure of what was asked of her, the trained cheerfulness regardless of internal state, the continuous possibility of unseen observation, the absorption of other people's needs and crises without any acknowledgement of the toll it takes. These did not disappear along with the equipment. They simply migrated into new forms, new industries, new small screens, carried forward by every worker since who has ever had to sound pleasant on a call they did not want to take, or maintain a composed expression on a video call while quietly exhausted, or respond instantly to a notification at an hour when their body was asking, quite reasonably, only to rest. Eleanor never knew any of this would happen. She never imagined a version of her job existing a century later, performed through devices she could not have conceived of, by people facing a version of the same exhaustion she carried home to her boarding house each morning. She simply lived her own night, at her own board, in her own dim room, doing what the job required, because the job required it. And because there was, for a young woman in her circumstances in 1934, very little room to ask whether the job ought to require quite so much. There is a particular kind of comfort available, oddly enough, in knowing that this feeling has a history, that the specific exhaustion of performing warmth on command, of being endlessly available, of carrying other people's needs while your own go unacknowledged, has been felt before, by a real woman, in a real chair, in a real room that smelled of hot wire and machine oil. You are not the first person to feel worn down by the demand to always sound pleasant. Eleanor Voss felt it first, or if not first, then certainly long before the language existed to name what she was feeling. She simply called it Tuesday, and then Wednesday, and then every night after that, because there was no other word available to her, and she went to the board anyway, and she came home anyway, and she rested when she could, in the same quiet way you are about to rest now. You have that room now, at least for tonight. The demand to be available has an endpoint, even if the world sometimes makes it difficult to see one. The demand to be pleasant, to be composed, to hold your own version of the voice with a smile for one more caller, one more message, one more small emergency that is not truly your own to carry, can be set down, at least until morning. The lamps are low. The truth has been told. Sleep well.